Hey, what's up guys? Welcome to my complete and updated Eula guide. As I'm sure you know, Eula is getting a rerun banner, and so I figured it's time to update my old Eula guide and make a new one that covers everything you need to know about this character. We're gonna go through her best builds, weapons, artifacts, teams, and all that stuff, and I'm also going to be covering in this video her optimal rotations, attack combos, and even an exact weapon ranking so that you guys can fully optimize your Eula based on what you have. Before I begin, I want you guys to know that I do stream most nights on Twitch, link in the description if you're interested, and with that being said, let's get into it. Alright, so the first thing I want to talk about in this video is actually Eula's talents, her skills, and give you guys a general idea of how to play her. A bit later in the video, I'll go into more optimal rotations and some advanced tips that you need to know to play her optimally, but for now, let me cover her abilities. Now, in general, Eula is the character who a lot of her damage will revolve around her burst. Her burst has the highest single number in the game. The scaling on it is absolutely amazing. It'll first of all deal an initial cryo hit, then it'll have this sword around you that deals massive amounts of physical damage and will stack up with every hit you do. After you use your burst, you want to be sure to spam your normal attacks and even your elemental skill, because every single normal attack you do, elemental skill, and even your burst damage all charge up your burst that will deal more damage based on how many stacks you get. Now, the exact scaling obviously depends on your level, but as you can see at level 9, it will get another 137% damage for every single stack. Now, something to keep in mind is that you're typically going to get around 14 stacks in an optimal rotation at C0. The maximum amount of stacks, however, is 30, but this is only really achievable with Constellations, as something like her C6 gives you more stacks inside of the duration. So typically you're going to get around 14, which is still a very huge scaling when you obviously add all these numbers up. Something to keep in mind with her burst is that the cooldown is pretty long of 20 seconds, but that gives you enough time to give her energy back to make up for this 80 energy cost burst. While the 80 energy cost seems like a lot, and it definitely is, there are ways to play around it, like giving her energy recharge and also especially running her with cryo batteries. So another cryo unit, someone like Diona or Rosaria, or even someone like Raiden can work, especially paired with other cryo units that can give energy to your Eula and allow her to get her burst back on cooldown without needing too much energy recharge. Other important things to note about your burst is that it lasts for 7 seconds, so that's how much time you have to stack it up all the way, and it also will explode whenever you swap out of Eula, so you can end it early by swapping, but usually you want to try to stay on field for her for that entire 7 seconds. Now, while her burst deals a ton of damage, she'll also deal a lot with just her normal attacks, as she does have some pretty good combos, like her 2 or especially her 4-hit combo, that just have pretty good scalings. Her elemental skill is also very nice, but you do need to know how to use this. Basically, you can either press or hold it. Press has a lower cooldown, but also deals less damage, and then her hold will not only deal more damage, but also shred the physical and cryo resistance of opponents if you manage to consume some of the Grimheart stacks you have that you gain when you use or press your elemental skill. Basically, to make this ability very simple, when you press, you're going to deal a bit of damage and stack your Grimheart. This is going to give you 1 stack for every time you press, and you can have a maximum of 2. Once you have 2 stacks, that's when I recommend using your hold E, holding your skill, because whenever you hold E, if it consumes any stacks, that's when you will shred that resistance of opponents. Also, while you have Grimheart stacks, you do gain defense and resistance to interruption, which can be nice since you're on field for so long. However, the main thing to note is that if you have 2 stacks of this Grimheart, you will also deal an insane amount of damage with this passive talent. You will have another mini sword explosion that will deal 50% of the base physical damage of your burst, so 50% of this number right here, which for me at talent level 9 is 674, so even half of that, around 337, is a lot of damage. And so while I'll talk about Eula's optimal combos a bit later in the video, I do recommend using your press for a lower cooldown and to gain energy until you have 2 stacks, and then holding your E once you have 2 stacks to deal more damage and reduce the resistance of enemies. And lastly, to make this a lot easier and your rotations more smooth, you have to know that your burst also gives you one of these stacks of Grimheart and resets the cooldown of your elemental skill. So in practice, what that means is you can use your elemental skill once by pressing it, then use your burst, which will give you a second stack of Grimheart, right? You gain the first from pressing, the second one from your burst, and it'll also reset the cooldown of your skill to where you can then hold it, consuming both stacks, reducing the resistance of opponents, and dealing massive amounts of damage with your passive that procs when you consume 2 stacks. There's a lot to explain with Eula's abilities. I hope I made it clear because I know a lot of people get confused with this, but again, a bit later in the video, I'll include some advanced tips and go into more details on a lot of her optimal combos. The last thing I want to mention is that her burst does not snapshot, which means it doesn't factor in the buffs for the whole duration, so you do want to keep that in mind. And finally, for Eula's talent priority, you want to maximize her burst first, as it will give you the biggest DPS increase, and then after that, your normal attacks, and then your elemental skill as the least important one that you can level at the end. Alright, so with that information out of the way, let's now talk about Eula's builds so that you guys can properly gear her. For her artifact sets, it's pretty straightforward. There's a few good options, but the Pale Flame is definitely the way to go in general. The reason for this is because this set was pretty much made for her. The 2-piece gives you 25% physical damage bonus, and then the 4-piece will double that and also give you 18% attack if you can fully stack the effect. And in case you're unaware, the way you do stack this effect is by hitting an opponent with your elemental skill, and once you manage to do that twice, you'll get all the bonuses. Now this does require some knowledge to fully stack and maintain the effect's uptime. However, it's really not that hard as your skill resets when you use your burst. So if you're doing a burst rotation, right, where you do your skill, then your burst, and then your skill again, you will fully stack the Pale Flame set to where it will be your best in slot. However, there are viable alternatives to where you don't have to run the 4-piece. The 4-piece Pale Flame is the best in slot, but 2 Pale Flame with 2-piece Bloodstained is actually pretty similar DPS wise, because you gain 50% physical damage bonus, 25% from the Bloodstained, and 25% from the Pale Flame, making you only lose out on that 18% attack, which you can easily make up for if, let's say, your Bloodstained has better substats than your Pale Flame. Now, there are also some other like decent 2-piece sets like Reminiscence or Gladiator that will give you 18% attack, and they are definitely viable depending on your substats, but in general, 2-piece Bloodstained with 2-piece Pale Flame, or as the best in slot, 4-piece Pale Flame are what I tend to recommend for a Eula build. Now, moving on to Eula's artifact stats, it's actually a bit more complicated than you might think. While for most DPS characters, right, you want crit damage, crit rate, and even attack percent to maximize your damage, and while that is still true for Eula, there's a couple of things you can do to actually optimize your build in a Eula specific way. For example, since her burst is such a big part of her kit, you can actually go for more crit damage than crit rate, for more than the typical 1-to-2 ratio that you're going for if you want to clear a hard abyss floor and effectively resetting until your burst crits. This isn't the most consistent build, but it is actually a viable strategy for clearing things like 12-3, or even for speedrunning if you want your burst to just deal as much damage as possible. In general though, crit rate, crit damage, attack percent, and energy recharge are the 4 stats you're looking for. The number one priority though, for a character like Eula who has a high energy cost burst, is going for enough energy recharge to where you can spam your burst on cooldown, and once you have that energy recharge, you can go for more offensive stats like crit damage, crit rate, and attack percent. For the exact amount of energy recharge you need, as I always say, it depends on many factors like your team, your rotation, playstyle, all that, but to give you guys a general idea, it typically ranges from around 120 to 160 depending on your team comp. I'll include on screen right now a table giving more specific numbers that I don't really want to go through one by one, but as you can see, the exact amount of ER you need greatly depends on what characters you're running with Eula. Do keep in mind, however, that the team comps are very important, and I always recommend running at least a cryo battery with Eula, another cryo character, or other energy generating characters, even someone like Raiden, who can give your Eula particles to where you don't need like an insane amount of energy recharge. If you're running Eula alone with no cryo supports, you're going to need way too much energy recharge to where it's not optimal at all, and I highly suggest running her with someone like Diona or Rosaria or even both. For your main stats, it's pretty straightforward. Your Goblet, you definitely want physical damage bonus because that's the main source of your damage, and for your Circlet, you're going for either crit damage or crit rate, both of them being good, but as I mentioned, crit damage can be especially powerful on Eula to make sure your burst deals an insane amount of damage. Now for your sands, it can actually depend, although attack percent is typically the best one. The only time you would want to go for energy recharge on the sands is if you don't have enough energy recharge on your substats, and if you need all of the ER that it gives you. Because obviously if you only need like 120 or 130 energy recharge, this whole 50 that it will give you can be wasted. But if you need all the energy recharge that it gives you and you don't have energy recharge on your substats, an energy recharge sands can be good. However, typically, in general, I do recommend an attack percent sands because it will be more damage if you can get as much energy recharge as you need on your substats. Alright, now for Eula's weapons, there's a lot of really good options for every player, and I'm also going to be including, as I mentioned in the intro, a full weapon ranking so that you guys can pick the best one for you. I do want to say though that even free-to-play players are in luck because something like the Luxurious Sea Lord, if you got it through the event that let you refine it all the way up to 5 for free, is really good for Eula because it gives you good attack and increases your elemental burst damage by 24% at refinement 5. This is a free-to-play option that's even competitive with other like gacha 4-star options, making it definitely a really good option for Eula. Before I move on to better options, I do want to say though that if you're a free-to-play player and you don't have the Luxurious Sea Lord, Snowtomb Star Silver or Prototype Archaic, both of them being very similar in DPS, can also be viable. Now for Eula's best weapons, there's actually a lot of really good ones. In terms of the best 4 stars, Serpent Spine, especially with Refinement, and Akumaru are both amazing and are definitely her best 4 stars. The Serpent Spine, even at Refinement 1, will give you a ton of damage, 6% for every stack you have, all the way up to 5 stacks, for a total of 30% damage at Refinement 1 off the effect alone, and then also giving you a ton of crit rate. The Akumaru will give you a lot of damage based on how much energy cost your whole team's bursts are when you add them up. And since Eula has a high energy cost and a lot of her supports like Beto or Raiden can have a high energy cost burst as well, this weapon can be amazing for Eula and either slightly better or slightly worse than the Serpent Spine depending on those factors, both of which being very good 4 stars, even competitive with some of the 5 stars. And so while she does have amazing 4 stars, her best weapons in general though are the 5-star weapons that are all pretty similar in strength for the most part. In fact, while the Song of Broken Pines is the weapon that was sort of designed for her, stacking up its effect when you do normal attacks, and then when it's fully stacked you gain even more attack, making it just a good weapon for her with an insane base attack and physical damage bonus on the stat. The DPS it gives you is very similar to other 5 stars that can even sometimes be better than it. For example, the Wolf's Gravestone is absolutely insane because it gives you an absurd amount of attack percent, and then if you can proc the passive, if you hit an opponent with under 30% HP, you will gain 40% attack to all of your party members, which can potentially be her best in slot if you do buff off-field supports that deal a lot of damage, or off-field supports that can snapshot it like Fischl or Beto, making Wolf's Gravestone an amazing option, and potentially even the best in slot. Now another 5-star weapon, the Skyward Pride, is also amazing and can once again even be the best option for you if you need the energy recharge that it gives you, because it does also have a good base attack and a good effect. Lastly, while the Unforged is typically the worst of the 5-star options, it's still very good because it's a stat stick, especially if your Eula is shielded with someone like Diona or Zhongli. And so overall, Eula just has a ton of good options, and the exact strength of each option can depend on many factors, but I'm trying to give you guys a general idea of which ones are better, and so here is a weapon ranking. Now do keep in mind this should be used for a general idea because as I mentioned, it depends on many things, but this is what you should expect from each of these weapons for your Eula herself. Now once again, this does only factor in Eula's damage, so something like the Wolf's Gravestone can even greatly increase in value if it's buffing your supports, and same thing with like the Akumaru, which can get better or worse depending on your team, and also something like the Serpent Spine based on how many stacks you're getting. While 4 stacks can be a realistic average, since you have to be on Eula for so long that you might lose a stack, if you can maintain 5 stacks with maybe like a Diona shield, it can definitely be better, and if you're losing all your stacks, then it will obviously be worse, although typically it's not too hard to maintain them, especially if you just run a shield. And so overall, these are the weapon rankings, but as I mentioned, they are quite variable, and she does have just an insane amount of good weapons. Alright, now what I want to do is take a bit of time to talk about Eula's optimal combos and just some advanced tips around this character. Now first of all, regarding her optimal combos, when we just look at the scalings on her attacks, basically you'll see that there's a few that have a bit higher scalings. Because of that, her best normal attack combos are typically the 4-hit and also the 2-hit, with the 4-hit combo typically being the best and what I recommend. Now doing 2 hits can be good as well, and even sometimes slightly higher DPS, but it's not what I recommend since you're typically going to be dash canceling, so if you always dash cancel after 2 hits, you'll like run out of stamina, and in general, I just recommend doing your 4-hit combo and also animation canceling it. Now to show you guys what I mean, this is what a normal sequence looks like, right? This is if you do all your normal hits. You can see it's a bit laggy, but what you can actually do is obviously animation cancel after whichever hit you want. So if you want to do 4 hits, you'll do 1, 2, 3, and then 4, and then you can just dash cancel and stop it right there. Now you can also do abilities to cancel it, basically like abilities to stop the combo. So 1, 2, 3, 4. And then you can use like your skill to stop it right there. All right, now regarding Eula's optimal combos, there's a few different ones, but in general, since your 4 normal attack string is so good, you're going to be utilizing that throughout the duration of your burst and also like in between. And so there are 2 main combos that I'm going to cover that are both very good and will give you the same amount of stacks, being a maximum of 14 for your elemental burst if done correctly. What your rotation looks like is using your elemental skill, then your burst, which will reset the cooldown of your skill, and then doing one of 2 things. The first and standard combo is doing 4 normal attacks after your burst, then holding your E and then doing another 4 normal attacks, and then your burst will detonate. That is the typical combo. It's not really difficult to do at all, and it also gives you the tankiness that the stacks of your E will provide you with. Now I did also want to mention that there is a combo that can do slightly more damage but is very frame perfect and difficult to do. That's why I don't recommend it as much, but basically what it is holding your skill on Eula right after your burst, then doing N4, dash canceling, and doing another N4. Now, I am using footage here from Eula Mains because I'm finishing editing this during maintenance because I'm late, so shout out to them for that, and I'll put the link in the description down below. But basically, and I'll rewind so you guys can see, what you do is after your burst, you hold your skill, then you do 4 normal attacks, dash cancel it instantly, and then do another 4 normal attacks, and then your burst will proc, dealing a bit more damage, but being harder to pull off. Now, that being said, your combo can be flexible flexible, as I mentioned. Also doing like 2 normal attacks can be good. And for example, if you're running Eula with Beidou, you can weave in some normal attacks in between your abilities, like in between your E and your Q, to proc Beidou's burst off your normal attacks. And I also wanted to re-emphasize quickly in this section that Eula is a character who gets a lot of her damage, about like 50% of it from her burst, to where if you miss it, or if it doesn't crit, or if enemies dodge it, stuff like that, since things can go wrong a lot, it is okay to reset like the Abyss floor until everything goes perfectly, to be able to get a much faster clear and get a lot more stars that way, especially if you're stacking crit damage or fighting enemies that can be annoying like the Magukenki that can dash away. Now I felt like I should include in this section as well that her burst is kind of like a movie. The cutscene is really long and you actually can't catch particles during its animation. So with other characters, when you can do something like, let's say, Eon, Rosaria, then Q, and as you can see, I caught those particles to where I'm starting right now with some energy during my burst like animation or whatever. With Eula, you can't really do that. So as you can see, I press E, then Q, which is optimal, right? Like that's what you're gonna do. But you don't really get particles from your E since you're going to be in that long cutscene of your burst. All right, now with that out of the way, let's talk about Eula's constellations quite briefly. First of all, her first constellation will buff your Eula when you consume the Grimheart stacks through your elemental skill. So if you just hold E, consume the stacks, you'll gain 30% physical damage, which lasts for 6 seconds for every stack you consume, for a maximum of 18 seconds, making it just more damage to your Eula. Now your C2, however, isn't amazing. It's not bad. It just makes your hold cooldown the same as your press cooldown, which can be nice, you know, after your burst when you use your hold E, or to even get more particles for your Eula because your hold E will generate more. And so it can be nice for like quality of life, but in general, your C2 just isn't needed and isn't that amazing overall. Your C3, however, is honestly pretty good because a 3 talent level increase on your burst represents a big DPS increase, as your burst is the main source or one of the main sources of Eula's damage, being a very huge number. Your 4th constellation is in practice not that needed. It can be nice for just a big screenshot or to fight bosses that have insane amounts of HP, but 25% more damage from your Lightfall swords against opponents that have less than 50% HP is something that can be useful, but in general isn't that needed because usually when you're fighting enemies that are low HP or when they get under half HP, your burst will kill them anyways, to where you don't really need that bonus damage. Your C5 increases your skill talent level, which isn't that great, and then your C6 is absolutely insane. This thing allows you to fully stack your burst, basically making you not only start with 5 stacks when you use your burst, but also giving your normal attacks, skill, and burst a 50% chance to generate another stack to your burst. You'll be proccing this effect many times, allowing you to effectively get way more stacks and even get the maximum of 30 stacks on your elemental burst, making it deal way more damage. Alright, so now for one of the most important sections, which is Eula's team comps. The reason why it's so important to have a good Eula comp is so that you alleviate a lot of her weaknesses and make her shine as much as possible. In fact, most Eula teams need 2 key components, which is a cryo battery first of all, to give her cryo particles so that she can spam her burst on cooldown, and secondly, you typically want an electro support so that you can proc the superconduct reaction, which decreases the physical resistance of opponents. Before I go any further, I do want to emphasize the fact that Eula is a physical carry, and so I want to stop people from thinking that she can be ran on reactions like reverse melt or freeze, because obviously Eula is a Claymore character, so she'll shatter anything that you can freeze, so it's not worth doing that. Same thing with like reverse melt, because her damage is mainly physical. Now that out of the way, there's a lot of ways to build her. For her electro battery, I typically recommend running her with someone like Fischl or Raiden, both being really good. Raiden can synergize well with Eula because she will not only increase your burst damage, deal a lot of damage on field, but also sort of fill in the gap in Eula's rotation. When Eula's burst is on cooldown, you can swap to your Raiden, use her burst, and not only deal damage with your Raiden, obviously, right, through her pretty high scaling on her burst, but also give a bunch of energy back to your whole team, letting your Eula gain her burst back. On top of that, if you don't have any of these units, I do want to mention that Electro MC can be viable as she gives you a ton of energy, but she won't give you nearly as much damage as someone like Raiden or Fischl, so I don't recommend her as much as the other Electro units, but she is still viable. For your cryo battery, there's a lot of options. Diona is usually the one that gives you the most energy because you can run her on a sacrificial bow or a Favonius. Both work, but sac bow lets you get more cryo particles by using your skill twice, and obviously her shield and her healing is nice as well, making her synergize very well with Eula. The same can be said with other cryo units that can work, like Rosaria, who also gives you a ton of crit rate and who also deals a lot of damage, and if you even need more particles with the Rosaria, you can run her on a Favonius Lance to give some more to your team. Someone like Kaya also works as well, although I typically prefer Rosaria for the crit rate and damage that she provides. And so as we saw, your core team is going to look something like this, with Eula plus an Electro character, either Fischl or Raiden, both of them being very good, and then a cryo battery. Now the last slot is flexible, but to give you guys some ideas and some good example teams, you can do a triple cryo team with someone like Rosaria that I mentioned earlier, which allows you to run very low energy recharge, or you could even run someone like Beidou, who if invested into will deal massive amounts of damage alongside your Eula. And I want to take some time to emphasize that Beto Eula teams are some of the highest DPS potential in terms of Eula's best teams if your Beto is well invested and has enough energy recharge. Now, if you are running Eula with Raiden, the same sort of logic applies to your team building, but there's actually a few really good options with Raiden. One of my personal favorites is this team where you run Eula and Raiden with Lisa. Now, Lisa is widely regarded to be a, bottom tier unit, but the reason why she can work so well with Eula, especially Eula Raiden, is actually for the buffs that she gives you. Now, if you do run your Lisa on Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers and you have her second Ascension passive unlocked, what you can do is basically just buff your Eula's burst damage and also your Raiden's damage. The way you do this is by number one, giving Thrilling Tales, which gives 48% attack to your Eula, but then by also using your burst and stacking energy recharge and noblesse oblige on your Lisa, to where you can use this burst on cooldown. It lasts 15 seconds, and throughout its duration, when it hits opponents, they will have 15% decreased defense for 10 seconds. So the uptime of this passive is very nice. It will last for Eula's burst and also for some of Raiden's burst when you swap into her after your Eula. This is why for like speedrunning and even just in a team like this, Lisa can be a honestly good option and a very underrated one. Another team I quite like is running Eula with Raiden and Rosaria and then having a flex slot at the end for a healer, where I like to put Bennett for a lot of damage since he's just a broken unit that can fit any team. Although typically if you are trying to build like two teams at once for the Abyss, I do suggest keeping Bennett for your other team and then running a team that runs Diona for Eula instead, because a lot of other units can be more dependent on Bennett, thinking of someone like Shang Ling. Do keep in mind though that in both the Eula Raiden team and the Eula official team, the last slot is pretty flexible. As I mentioned, you can run another cryo unit, someone like Beto, even other characters like Zhongli or Albedo can work as off-field supports. Lastly, I did want to mention that while I don't recommend Xinyan, she does have a lot of positive synergy with Eula, and I know a lot of people are going to ask me about it. The reason for this is because, especially if you have her 4th constellation, which decreases physical res of opponents, and when you pair that with her talent, that will also give you physical damage when you're shielded, she can just buff your Eula a little bit, and is definitely a viable option in Eula teams, so I wanted to mention her, although I don't recommend her as much as some of the other supports I mentioned, like a Beto or another cryo battery, but she is someone you can play if you like her. Alright, so now I'm going to close things off with a DPS showcase, just to show you guys my Eula in action. She is C0, so this is a more realistic showcase if you're a C0 Eula, although keep in mind I am very high investment. This is a late game Eula. My talents, as you saw, are 8, 6, 9. I have a Wolf's Gravestone Refinement 1. Really good artifacts though, 2 Pale Flame, 2 Bloodstained with a pretty good ratio. I have just enough energy recharge and then almost 200 crit damage with 65 crit rate. Now the exact artifacts might switch a bit for like maybe some of the one-shots I'll include as well, but that's what I'm going to be using for the Abyss showcase, where I'm going to be doing a full floor 12 clear. So with that being said, I hope you enjoyed the guide and I hope you'll enjoy the showcase. Let's go. So yeah, overall, Eula, in my opinion, is someone who's tons of fun. I've played her a lot and even leveled her talent levels, which is not something I do on characters that I don't like that much, because I find her burst very enjoyable when it one-shots enemies, but it can be frustrating to reset if it misses, which is definitely something that I've had to do a lot on my stream, just to get like perfect or good footage. There's a lot of times where it wouldn't crit or I'd miss it or something like that. Overall, Eula is a very powerful physical carry, who is a hyper carry who's very resin expensive, so she gets a lot better late game if you do invest into her. With that being said, I hope this guide was helpful and that I covered everything that you need to know about Eula. If there's anything I want to add, it will be in a pinned comment. And also look forward to my new Albedo guide coming soon, as there's a lot of new artifact sets and weapon for that character. With that being said, that's about it for me. So I hope you enjoyed, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.